Welcome everyone. This is to the Disaster Insurance Law webinar this morning with Legal Aid New South Wales and Legal Aid Queensland. To begin, we would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land. We would also like to pay respect to the elders of this land, both past and present, and extend that respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people attending today or watching the recording. So the webinar is being recorded and it will be available up on the Legal Aid New South Wales YouTube channel after probably next week sometime. I'm not sure if it'll also go on the Legal Aid Queensland YouTube channel, but I'm sure you'll be able to find it either way. So without further ado, we'll move forward. So Marta, were you going to talk about this? Why are we running this webinar?
I'm happy to get us underway on that one.
Okay, thanks, Paul.
Welcome everyone. So Loretta, Marta and I have been doing this disaster insurance law work for a number of years now, and we thought it was a good opportunity as disaster season is upon us again. And I know New South Wales and Queensland in particular have been having some pretty severe hailstorms and a tornado in Bathurst yesterday. And that probably shows that climate change is increasing the frequency and severity of the sort of disaster events that we all help people with. And so what we wanted to do is empower people who are not normally involved in this space, both lawyers and community workers and financial counsellors, with the skills to be able to identify the sorts of issues that clients are going to come across and give them the starting point to give their clients the best opportunity with which to get the best possible result from their insurers. Next slide, please.
Here it comes.
Excellent. So there's a long shopping list of stuff that we're going to cover during the course of this webinar here. They're what we see as the most common problems that we come across when we're dealing with disaster insurance law. I would encourage you as we're going, if you've got questions, please ask them, because the three of us are the sort of people that like having a chat, and questions give us the perfect opportunity to explore the sorts of issues that you might have already seen or are pressing issues that you want to know about. So please ask those questions as you're going. So Loretta, how do we go about helping people in a disaster?
Thanks, Paul, for that. Well, it says it there on the list right in front of us as to how we can help people, but I want to explore it a bit more. And I thought I might start by telling you a couple of stories from my own personal experiences with being both involved in a bushfire and then hearing the stories from people who have suffered loss as a result of bushfires or floods. So it really brought home to me last year that everybody who's involved in a natural disaster might have suffered trauma, even if they're not directly affected by it. And what I mean by that is I was down on the south coast of New South Wales when the bushfires happened last year. And at the time, I spent some time on a beach in Malua Bay, being with a whole lot of other people as everything burnt around us. And I thought I was quite fine. In fact, I was really quite chirpy about it, wrote a lovely Facebook post. And then a few months later, and then left soon afterwards. So none of my friends or family suffered, lost anyone that we knew or had a house burned down that we knew. But I realized a few months later when I was telling this story to somebody else that in fact I had been affected by it, and I couldn't believe that I was having quite strong feelings about the event so many months later. So can you imagine if that was my experience as someone who'd only been peripherally involved or exposed to it, what the difference would have been for somebody who was actually there, lost property, lost family, saw the people around them have the same sort of experience. It would be it would affect them for a very long time. And the other two stories were actually stories that were relayed to me from the Victorian bushfires that happened not in 2019 and 2020, but the ones that happened in the 2000s. And I remember speaking to someone about their experience in that bushfire, and they were talking many years later, and you could still hear the distress in their voice. And it was very surprising for me because I thought that the person I'd spoken to was extremely a very strong person, and I was surprised that they were still so affected by it many years later. And the other story was of a lawyer who was taking statements from people in those same fires who'd lost loved ones, and his vicarious trauma was also relayed to me. And even though I didn't even hear the story from the victim, I was really affected by the way in which he told that story. So in terms of trauma, I think it's really important that we not only that we really think about referral to, that we're not the social workers, we're not the psychologists, we're not the doctors. We've got a job to do, but it's really important that we refer people appropriately and we refer ourselves. The other thing that I would say about the responding to people during a disaster, we've got to employ all the techniques that we use in our daily work, because on the whole, we are always dealing with people who are at the margins in the casework that we do. We have techniques about how to deal with distressed people at risk of losing their homes in other situations. So, and I think you really need to sharpen that when you come to dealing with people during a disaster. The second point that is made here, tread carefully and kindly, but do not fall into the trap of telling people what they want to hear. I think that not only applies in a disaster, but in any of the work that we do. Often when people come to me, particularly for disaster insurance claims or any sort of other legal work, they have often been told not the hard facts as to what their situation is and what their merit is in the claim that they're making. I think it just distresses people more if you're not honest. You can do it in a kind way, but you're not honest in telling people what their real situation is, whether they will be able to whether they will succeed in a claim or not. It's not helpful in the long run. And
the key thing people always describe that to me as is hope's the most powerful thing you can give somebody, but false hope is the cruelest thing you can give somebody.
that's a perfect way of putting it. We see it too often, and Paul, you would agree, we have to deal with that because often people on the ground want to, give people hope. And I think sometimes not only is it cruel, but it can be actually disadvantageous because people then can't make the tough decisions earlier on when financially or even emotionally it would have helped them. I think that's it for that slide, unless Marta, you've got anything to add, or Paul?
No, the key bit to reducing trauma, I would say, is make sure they only tell their story once because of the reasons you identified. It's traumatic to tell it once, but if you have to tell it multiple times, it's even worse.
So good file notes are a really good idea.
Your audience is agreeing with you. Someone's written excellent point. So I will change the slide.
Yes, please.
Okay, so it's coming up now, making an insurance claim.
All right, so I'm going to talk briefly about this. So in terms of making an insurance claim, if you haven't already come across this, it's good to be mindful of it. The bush telegraph is a real thing. And in some ways it can be helpful. everybody doing the same thing and a sense of camaraderie, but in a lot of ways it can be, there could be a spread of misinformation. So, you know, points that we put up there on the slide, that sometimes it's, you know, people saying what they think you should be saying to insurers and what you shouldn't be saying to insurers, whether you should be making a claim or not, when in actual fact that doesn't really assist a person in assessing their full situation and whether what they should be doing. Our advice is really simple. It's always put in a claim. If you've got a client that has been impacted by a disaster, they have insurance, what they need to be doing is just putting in a claim. When they put in a claim, it's really then up to the insurer to assess the claim and decide whether or not to approve a claim. That's really their job. So listen, let's let the insurers do their bit. They do the assessment of the claim and then they can say yes or no, and then we look at it further, but we will talk about that in a little later. The big message for your clients is that they don't lose anything by lodging a claim, and in some cases they have a lot to gain by lodging a claim, because, you know, lots of people suffer massive damage to their property. Some properties are total loss, that sort of thing. And if they don't lodge a claim, then there's no way of looking at whether they could get some help for the product that they've been paying for all this time. So our advice is always simple: just lodge a claim. We deal with what happens afterwards, but lodge a claim, because you can't raise a dispute with your insurer until you've lodged a claim and a decision is being made. So first things first, lodge a claim. Kerry, can we go to the next slide?
Yes, that's coming up now.
All right, so once a claim is lodged, what will happen is the insurer will send out assessors. Now, it could be different types of assessors depending on the type of damage or the type of disaster at the time. So they may send out a couple of assessors, but that's the first step. Is they'll send out an assessor, they'll look at the damage, they'll put together a report for the insurer, and obviously send it off to the insurer. The insurer will then assess the claim, look at the policy, see what the client is covered for, and if there are any issues with the coverage, then they will set that out in any decision that they make. But I think that another key message here is, you know, they have these assessors that go out. They may be qualified assessors, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're infallible. You know, it doesn't mean that just because they've put together a report that there's no way of you disputing that. So we do that all the time. Paul, Loretta, everybody that's working in this space, we do it all the time. We dispute the assessors' reports. You know, I'm not a builder or I'm not a hydrologist, but even then I can look at those reports and see where things don't quite make sense or they don't quite line up. And you generally can lodge a dispute about that. So we'll talk about the dispute process a little bit later. But I think the key message about making a claim is make the claim, lodge the claim, let the insurer do their assessments, let them make a decision about the claim. Then we look at the decision and whether there are any grounds you might have in disputing that decision if it doesn't go in your favour.
And I think the other really key point, Marta, about this is making an insurance claim is free. There will be people following natural disaster who will come door knocking saying they can do all of that for you for a fee. And that costs you money that usually comes out of your insurance claim. So really important for the community workers out there who are often on the ground before us to remind people you don't need to pay anybody to make an insurance claim for you.
Someone's asked, oh, sorry, someone's asked a question about whether legal aid ever helps with making the claim. Oh.
The legal aid, so we can, part of the advice that we can give will assist in them making the claim. Sometimes in a disaster, they often set up a recovery centre or a disaster recovery centre. And when they do that, it's sort of a one-stop shop where all the service providers are there, including legal services, and insurers are often there as well. So in some cases we can, on the spot, connect the client with the insurer, and that will kick off the claims process. It's actually not a very difficult process really for insurers. It's really about notifying them. In some cases, some insurers, I mean, lots of insurers are being innovative about the way they make claims easier for people to lodge. So it could be just over the phone, apps. People have apps now. Some insurers might have an app that you can lodge a claim. There's different methods of lodging a claim, but we can assist. We're not necessarily going to lodge the claim for you, but we can certainly assist you to kick off that process of lodging the claim. That's for you as well, Paul and Loretta.
Yeah, the other thing I'd say about it too is there's no legal magic to actually making the claim. The legal issues come later on if the claim is refused.
And you really, and can I just put this in, because Amada talked about the wrong thing or the right thing to say to an insurer. I just think you have to be honest in your communication with the insurer and not mislead them. And if you do that, then the claims process is easy. If you have that in the back of your mind, that you just want to be honest in your dealings with the insurer and not mislead them, you'll be fine. The other thing that I was just going to say about the assessors are not infallible, there were some really good examples of that during the 2011 floods, where hydrologists would say water came from a particular direction and the clients were able to say, well, no, that's not the way it happened. And that was really effective in making a case that, in fact, the water that came onto the property was stormwater or didn't come from the river, and it meant that they won their cases. So it can be very simple things that clients saw and heard that will make a huge difference.
There's a question here too to ask, is there a time limit that the client has to lodge a claim, Loretta?
Yes, there is a time limit for people to lodge claims, and if they're not, probably the best advice that I always give is lodge the claim as soon as possible, because over time the evidence degrades, and if there is a dispute, it's much harder for both sides to be able to say, well, this is a legitimate claim or not a legitimate claim. The other thing is there's also time limits that even when you lodge a claim, there is then a time limit as well as to once you get the decision from the internal dispute resolution section, you have a time limit as to how long you can have until you go to the Ombudsman. The thing about time limits though is that they're very dependent on the individual circumstances of a particular case as to when they will run from.
So
Okay.
the key bit there, Loretta, is there's no time limit, legal time limit on making a claim as such, but the longer you leave it, it makes, as you point out, it makes it much harder to be successful.
To that, as an insured person, you do have a duty to mitigate your losses. Part of it is to lodge your claim as soon as possible to prevent further damage. So, so let's look at flood damage, water damage. The longer you leave water damage, the worse the problem gets. And if you're part of the reason why it hasn't been looked at, then that could be problematic for yourself or your claim. So the earlier you can lodge, the better. As soon as you know that there is a claim, that there is damage, lodge your claim, let the insurer do the assessment and make a decision whether a claim is to be paid or not. But your step, the client step or the insured step is just to lodge the claim.
Okay, you ready to move to the next slide?
Let's move on.
Okay, so this one is cash settlements versus a rebuild of the property, and there's some notes on the slide there.
Yeah, Marta and I are going to tag team about this because this is a bugbear of both of our lives, I think.
Okay, off you go.
So just to set the scene for those who haven't experienced it, cash settlements are where, and rather than repairing your property, an insurer will offer to pay you some or all of the money they would have expended in rebuilding the property, and in a sense leave the responsibility to repair the property to you. And my experience following natural disasters is there's only really limited circumstances where a cash settlement is a good idea for a person who's not the insurer. And we set out the examples there on the slide. And the classic one for me there is where the client doesn't want to rebuild the property. And the classic example there is around it's usually following a cyclone and or a bushfire, where people don't want to have the experience of being involved in that event again. And the reality of particular parts of New South Wales and Victoria and North Queensland is we get regular cyclones and we get regular bushfires. But the problem that occurs with a cash settlement is people think it's an easy way out, don't they, Marta? They get sick of the process, they want to get back in their home, and they think if I accept the money, I can get the repairs done quicker. Is that the case though, Marta? Can an individual get the repairs done quicker than an insurer usually?
Yeah, that's harder because in my experience, it's not necessarily the case that a person can organise their repairs quicker than an insurer. And I think in the most recent experience of the bushfires, the 2019-2020 bushfires was a massive example of that, particularly with the pandemic that followed straight after the bushfires. You know, the available services are limited, people's access to it is limited, but insurers have whole lists of repairers that are available to them, and they can make arrangements a lot quicker than, you know, individuals. But I guess it really just depends on the individual circumstances and exactly how, you know, how their recovery journey is going to work best for them. But yeah, the question about whether they can organise it quicker than an insurer, I think for the most part, in my experience, it's been that they haven't, it's not really the case that they aren't able to organise anything quicker than an insurer.
And what about purchasing power? My experience is even if that is better for you, it usually costs you a lot more money.
Yeah, I agree. I think I agree with that. And also, I mean, managing a project like a rebuild is a massive task, and it's not something that most people have experience in doing. I would certainly struggle with managing such a project, but you know, insurers do this stuff all the time. And it's something that they easily do.
Let's unpack that a bit too, because when we talk about managing a project, people think it's just about getting the builder in so they can start the rebuild. But it's much more than that, isn't it? It's about things like timing, getting the plumber in the right, the electrician in the right order, so that the bathroom can be done appropriately in the context of having a builder and those tradesmen who are rebuilding your bathroom as well, isn't it?
That's correct. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And if you haven't had that experience in doing that before, let alone having to deal with the aftermath of a disaster where you're a traumatized person, it's a traumatic event to go through. I mean, managing a project would be even harder. if you're also having to, manage your recovery, not just for yourself, but maybe your family members and maybe just your neighbours as well. You're all in it, but there's a lot on your plate after a disaster. So, yeah, certainly something I would think about. What the benefits are for a cash settlement or for your insurer to do the rebuild.
And that's not to mention that if the insurer does it, they guarantee the repairs. If you do it, the insurer won't.
That's right. There are a lot of risk that goes with managing such a massive project. Lots of risk in what, sort of problems that could come about in a rebuild. But yes, if you're going with your insurer, letting your insurer do the rebuild, one of the benefits in doing that is that guarantee that they will they accept the responsibility for the workmanship and the materials that are used. But obviously, if you're taking cash settlement and dealing with this yourself, then all the risk is on you. So there's quite a bit there to consider as well.
Yeah, I would agree with that. The other thing worth knowing is that the insurers are now required, or I think it's Monday, sorry, it's Tuesday, the 5th of October, will be required to start giving us cash settlement sheets when a client is offered a cash settlement. And if any client is in a position where they're not understanding that cash settlement sheet, or they're not understanding the scope of works, which we'll come to, they should ask questions about that. Don't just accept what you're being told by an insurer, because if they can't explain to you what's happening, then there's a problem, because they're not explaining it well enough, because they should be able to explain it in such a way that somebody who's never dealt with an insurance claim before should understand what's happening. And I reckon that's a really important lens for all of us to be putting in our interactions with people following a natural disaster. And that is, we've dealt with all of this before, and in the three of our cases, thousands of times before. And that can sometimes colour our understanding, and we can fall into the trap, all of us working in this space, of assuming that what's being said by the insurer is being understood by the client. Always test that, because we can get coloured by the jargon as well, just by virtue of working in the space.
Paul, can I just ask, for the benefit of the audience, so what sort of things will be in these cash settlement documents that are being, or handouts that are going to be provided? The sort of issues that we've just looked at here, or?
Yeah, the insurance, I think it's fair to say, Marta, the insurance industry did a pretty good job of consulting with us and other people who work in the space about what should be in those sheets. And have made it certainly reasonably understandable. Me being me, I will always have a view that you can make things even more understandable than they already are. And I will continue prosecuting that case with the insurers, but they've done a good job of including the types of issues that we're talking about in these two things.
I think that the biggest benefit from that change, that requirement to give that information, is that now consumers can make an informed decision about how the claim is to be settled. In the past, what we've seen is that insurers will make a decision about a claim. If they approve the claim and do a cash settlement, they just deposit the money into a bank account. It could be large sums of money. It just shows up in a bank account, and that's the end of the matter really for the insurer, but that's not the end of the matter for consumers or for our clients. And an example of where giving them a moment to really consider their options in how to settle the claim is where it's important is where there's been a partial loss, and insurers, if they're just dumping money into a bank account and not explaining what that covers, then your client does not know really whether the full benefits have been paid out under the policy. So it's important to, even though an insurer has approved or accepted the claim and approved their claim, and they pay the money, for a lot of people might say, oh, well, great, they did the right thing, they sent me money and that's it. But the thing is, there could be, and we've run these matters, we've disputed these matters where cash settlements have been made, and then we've looked at the policy and identified, well, actually there's a couple of benefits that hasn't been paid out. Or that's not, we can't see how that's been included in the cash settlement that's been made. So it's always important to ask questions, and I think that the requirement to set out the cash settlement information for consumers before they settle the claim could really help those questions, sort of help people to question those things and get some help in making decision, an informed decision about how their claims to be dealt with.
Yep. And this is something we're emphasising. You won't have seen these sheets before. If you're out there and you've been in a disaster before, you won't have seen them before. These are brand new. Yep. So when you encounter them, we're always looking for feedback on whether you think they're working or not, so that we can feed that back. And the other issue I think, Marta, we haven't covered that's really important here is it's important to give people time to think where there's a mortgage, because mortgages and cash settlements don't always talk to each other.
We've got a slide on that, Paul, later on. So.
All right. We will park that thought and come to it later, but that's another important consideration in this space. So that's probably a good move on unless there are questions.
There's a question here. Can an insurer force a policyholder to take a cash settlement? Do you want to answer that, Paul?
Look, my view is if the client wants to fight it, I will always run that, because I find where insurers are wanting people to take a cash settlement, it's often because a insured is asking a lot of questions. There will be really good reasons to do a cash settlement, some of which we highlighted earlier, such as the people don't want to go back. But if they're wanting a rebuild and the insurer is saying no, I'm usually asking a lot of questions as to why. What do you think, Marta?
Yeah, I agree. I think one thing to be aware of is in the insurance policies, they often say that it is up to the insurer to make a decision about how a claim is to be settled. But our experience of running these disputes, and also the approach that AFCA has, is the insurer has a duty of utmost good faith towards the insured. They also should be acting in what is fair and reasonable in the circumstances under that. And in some cases, even though the insurer might actually be entitled to settle a claim by way of a cash settlement, if your client is in a position that there's just no way that they would be able to do the rebuild themselves, and I'm thinking of, maybe that elderly couple who've lost everything, and they might have mobility issues, all sorts of other issues. They're just not going to be in a position to organise their own repairs, their own rebuild. So in that circumstance, even the insurer may actually be entitled to do a cash settlement. Given the circumstances, the cash settlement wouldn't be the best scenario for that couple, wouldn't be the most fair way to settle the claim, in which case you would raise that issue with the insurer, flag the vulnerabilities of your client, any other issues that they should be considering, and then setting out the way that the claim should be settled, which might be that they do that the insurer does the rebuild. My experience has been that most insurers are quite open to that, and it's certainly the approach of AFCA, AFCA being the Australian Financial Complaints Authority. Their approach is to look at what is the fair and most reasonable way of handling that situation, and they will approve decisions where they think the insurer should do the rebuild rather than the cash settlement. So you definitely can ask, and you should ask the insurer if there's a particular way a claim should be settled that would work in your client's situation, then you definitely should be asking the insurer for that.
Yep, agreed.
There's another question here. What should a client do where they disagree that pre-existing damage exists, but the client cannot afford to pay for expert opinion to challenge the insurer's evidence?
Yes, that's another bugbear that I think we should deal with it now, even though there's a slide later on. We can partially deal with that now. That's usually because there's a maintenance or repair clause in every insurance policy that says words to the effect of, if you haven't maintained the property properly or there's pre-existing damage, we have the right to deny the claim. I think it's fair to say in both our experiences, all of our experiences, insurers are fairly bad at dealing with maintenance and repair clauses and pre-existing damage clauses. Because what we tend to find is the assessor's report will say something like, we don't think there's been effective maintenance on this property, or we don't think they've upkept the property properly, without actually saying the following things weren't done properly, which has meant the property has not been maintained. Like the classic I saw following a cyclone was, oh, the roof wasn't properly maintained. And when we questioned it, there was one nail missing from the roof, which hadn't been, which had absolutely no difference as to whether the 250k an hour winds ripped the roof from the house. So my advice in that sort of scenario is to get help from one of us or your equivalent in your state, because those things should be tested. It's a different story if the pre-existing damage report says, oh, there was a 3-foot hole in the roof that they were told about and didn't repair, or they previously had some stored damage and got a cash settlement saying they would fix the roof, and there's evidence to say they didn't fix that previous damage, then that's a legitimate reason to deny a claim. But if that's not explained, or there's not that legitimate reason, absolutely question it.
I think though the question was, Paul, in relation to how, if there is an issue, if they have put a report through properly and you still don't think it's right, the issue is really that people do need to, they're not going to be able to get the funding from anyone else to get the expert reports done, particularly at the early stages when they're going through IDR. That's the issue for
That's
people.
correct. That's correct. And often where you end up is asking for another report to be done when you get to AFCA.
Yeah, exactly.
Having another qualified person make a report or give an opinion is obviously going to be very helpful evidence, but we shouldn't discount the evidence that client can actually provide in their own what they witnessed happened on the day. If they've been living in the property, if they've had work done before, they have a lot that they can actually raise on their own without actually getting expert reports done. And certainly you don't necessarily need to wait for an expert report to lodge a complaint. You lodge the complaint, you raise the issues that your client is aware of that can instruct you on, things that should be considered that could have an impact on the decision made about the claim. You don't need to just wait for or get an expert report. I've run matters where I've raised the issue. Remember, we're in the civil jurisdiction where it's about on the balance of probabilities, and if you can raise something based off of your client's instructions, which asks the question, then puts it back on the insurer to prove further. I mean, the onus is on the insurer to prove that an exclusion applies, that they can rely on it to decline your claim. So if you've got some evidence, whether it's an expert or not, I'm just pointing out that you don't necessarily always need an expert report to lodge a further complaint. Raise it, your client's experience, all of that, they're all valid evidence, and you can raise it to start the process. Once it gets in, if it has to go further and it goes to AFCA, for example, then potentially it could be ordered, or AFCA could say, another report needs to be done by the insurer. There's lots of ways that this could play out.
Okay, thank you. I do have another question. I'm not sure if it's going to be handled later in the webinar, but it is, how do you handle an insurer that has only paid for half of the flood damage to the house, but's declined the damage to the house on the outside, like the gutters and downpipes? Is that...
I think we should just leave it in terms of challenging an insurance claim, that question.
Okay.
Otherwise, we're not going to finish.
Okay, well, we'll go here.
I think we've covered that one.
Oh, you've covered this one that's coming up. Then what about building codes? That's the next one.
So I'll be very quick. I'm very conscious of time. This is really raised as to when you're likely to get a cash settlement. And it really relates to underinsurance as well. So if, and I think it's easiest explained with a really good example that we talked about yesterday. So thanks, Paul, for this example. So if you have a 20,000, say you have a shed that's worth $20,000, the building codes have changed in relation to that, and as to how it should be rebuilt. And there's damage to the shed of $12,000. But the sum insured that the sum that the shed is insured for is only $10,000. In that particular case, because the building codes have changed, the damage is more than what the shed is insured for. The maximum that the insurance company will pay out is 10 grand. They will pay it to the person. They will not repair to the value of the $10,000 because they won't be able to meet the new building codes. They will, however, so if you had a house that was built in the 19 whatever and is no longer doesn't meet the new building codes, and they want to cash settle for and there's a sum insured rather than rebuilding, they will, however, make the house safe. So it's not like they'll just leave people in the lurch. However, that has been a problem in the Springfield storm event that happened last year. And in that particular case, there was the storm, there was damage to people's roofs, there wasn't a quick enough response to do temporary repairs, and there was further damage caused. From an insurer's point of view, it's in their interest to make at least the temporary repairs, because otherwise they could be liable or would be liable for the further damage in those circumstances. I don't want to say more about that about the building codes, unless Paul or Marta, you've got anything more to add?
I think it flows nicely into the slide Marta's going to talk about rebuilding a property.
Yeah.
Okay. Marta, just be aware that when you start talking, it takes a little bit of time for your computer to catch up with you. I think it's something with your microphone. So it comes good, but just at the start when you're talking, it's just a bit quiet.
All right, I'll try to stop waving my hands around too much. Maybe that's coming in a bit. Talking about rebuilding a property, a scope of work. So this is extremely important. Settlement of these claims, because they're large claims in a lot of cases. With the properties, to progress it, the scope of works is required, and set up that information there in that slide. So I won't go through them point by point. I'll just focus on a couple of things. One thing to be aware of in the scope of works is that's really how the insurer establishes what they agree to cover. And the scope of works, it's not necessarily going to cover everything that you think needs to be fixed. So it's important for you to go through the scope of works, or for your client to go through the scope of works to see really whether it addresses the damages that they think needs to be repaired, or the damages that was caused in the disaster or in the event, the insured event, and that it is mentioned in the scope of works. And if it's not in there, or it's not clear whether it's in there, then they should definitely be asking questions, ask the insurer questions about where, whether they can point out where a particular issue on the property is covered in the scope of works. One thing that we always come across in rebuilding a property, particularly after the bushfire, is where there are the involvement of the bushfire attack levels. The bushfire attack levels can have an impact on the cost of rebuilding your property, and it relates to what Loretta spoke about earlier, about the increase in cost that could come about because the bushfire attack level could have changed. Well, they will always, in my experience, they've always changed after a bushfire has happened. But the bushfire attack level, that is an Australian standard in construction, and it talks about it's really your level of bushfire risk that affects your development requirements. You can get help in figuring out what your bushfire attack level is for your area. It's generally affected by the area that you live in, things like vegetation and the distance of vegetation to your home, and all sorts of things. The slope of the land, I think, is part of that as well. But as part of the rebuild process, you'll need to confirm what the bushfire attack level is. And as I mentioned before, that could have a major impact on how much it will actually cost you to repair your property. In a lot of cases, it results in people finding out that they're actually underinsured, so they don't have enough insurance cover to cover the cost of their rebuild. So it's possible that when they signed up for insurance at the time, the value of the property and the value of the cost to rebuild at the time before the event, their cover would have been fine for it, but immediately after the event, when you're lodging your claim and they're working out the cost to rebuild, your bushfire attack level can really impact that and result in you actually being underinsured. To find out more information, I think there is about 6 bushfire attack levels, ranging from the bow low, which is the lowest bushfire risk, and then it goes up to something like the flame zone, which is like the highest level that you could be in, which is that you're in extreme risk. In New South Wales, I'm aware that the New South Wales Rural Fire Service can assist with figuring what your BAL is for your area or for your home. And I'm fairly certain that each state, the fire service of each state can actually assist with that too. Sorry,
I was just going to say, Marta, that someone's agreeing with you. They're saying in Gippsland, they've found for each BAL rating increase, it adds $50,000 to $100,000 cost to the rebuild.
Wow.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that we saw in the recent bushfires with the pandemic that followed is just the cost of everything increased. Just generally, that's not even talking about BALs. So once you throw that in the mix, you know, unfortunately, a lot of people found that they were significantly underinsured, which is a problem for them to rebuild. And I think we talk a little bit about that a little bit later, I think.
Yeah, and I guess what we're also saying is if you haven't looked at your insurance cover recently, it's probably worth everybody who's tuned in just having a bit of a check about those sort of things, because the cost of everything has gone up. And that's even before you start looking at your renewal and looking at how much your insurance premiums go up following a cyclone, a flood, or a bushfire.
Yeah, that's right. And I just mentioned that, you know, the value of your property and the cost to rebuild is not the same thing. So be mindful of that when you're looking, if you're looking at your policy now in preparation, but also afterwards, if you find yourself in the unfortunate position that you hadn't updated your policy and you've made a claim and found that you're underinsured. A lot of people will say that you know, well, my property is valued at this much. That could be correct, but the cost to rebuild is probably a lot more, especially when you have a change in the bushfire attack level. The materials that you need to use to rebuild it will be different.
And some insurers, Marta, have started putting up some decent calculators on their websites that might help with doing that sort of calculation.
Yes, I think so. But again, that's really just a guide. I mean, look, at the end of the day, I think it's quite difficult to work out, like, pinpoint an exact amount. But there are certain steps that you can take to sort of inform you better in what you end up settling for in terms of, you know, the amount you agree to be covered for. So calculators on the insurance websites can certainly help with that, give you a sort of, or at least a starting point of an amount that you should be looking at. But yeah, they're certainly available. But again, if you live in a bushfire-prone area, then maybe getting in contact with your fire service or your rural fire service in your area could also be helpful. So there's lots of steps that you could take to do as best you can to prepare for the disaster season.
Someone has asked this question, Marta, is how do you accurately estimate how much it will cost to rebuild? Is that how long is a piece of string sort of question, or?
Unfortunately, there are those steps that I mentioned that can help you in estimating as best as possible. But yeah, I think it'll be hard to pinpoint an exact number.
The reality is, though, Marta, the people with the most data that would be able to give the best ballpark figure for a particular region is actually your insurer. Ring them up and ask.
Yeah.
That's good advice. So you ready to move on to the next one? Okay. What if there's a mortgage? That's the new part just before, I think. Were you going to talk about that, Paul, or?
No, I was going to.
Loretta, okay, sorry.
Yes,
Okay.
I'm going to be talking about it. That's why I didn't want Paul to steal my thunder beforehand when he started to go there. I
Fair
thought
enough.
this is my slide. So this is actually a really critical question. If you have a mortgage, don't accept it before you speak to your lender. And I can best illustrate this by one of the people that I spoke to years ago that came to see me, and they'd had a home that had been destroyed in a fire. And 12 months later, it was a very large family, or 18 months later, the block was cleared. They didn't have a house because the lender had taken the whole of the cash settlement and paid out the mortgage, and then and the people weren't in a position to borrow money from anywhere else to be able to rebuild their home. In those cases, particularly where the lender is not coming to the, so if there is a matter where you must accept the cash settlement for a variety of reasons and the lender is unwilling to negotiate in any way, that is a matter I think that you can take to their internal complaints, and then if you're not happy with the outcome, to go to the Australian Financial Complaints Authority. And this is, and of course, it's particularly important if the amount that's being paid out is not going to be sufficient to actually repair all of the property because there was an underinsurance issue or the building codes have changed, because it will mean that you still have a requirement to keep your property insured, and if you can't for the purposes of your mortgage, and if you can't insure it because all of the repairs can't take place, you're breaching your mortgage and loan agreements as well. So all we can really stress from this point is to make sure that you've spoken to your lender, and that if you're unhappy with their decision, you go through their internal processes and then the external processes. That's all I've got to say. That's a very quick response. Is there anything else, Paul or Marta, that you wanted to add?
Loretta, is there a potential problem in this story of a person having to sell the unrepaired property and ending up with a shortfall on their mortgage?
I think that's always a problem if they have to end up selling because they can't meet the mortgage repayments, because who's going to buy a property in those circumstances? And if there is a shortfall, then they will be liable for that shortfall. So I'm certain that these matters, in a sense, I think the lenders, if people go to the lenders and speak to them about it, it is something that can be resolved. It's not something that I've had come across my desk a lot, except for in that one circumstances which I just spoke about before. But that was really in a case where I think the borrowers did not speak to the lenders at all because of a language issue. So it's really important that, like I said again, it's about communication, and really important that we have that conversation with the lender.
Okay. I'll move to the next slide then. Contents claims.
Conference, I think. I'm just going to start off, but I know there's a bit of a lag, and hopefully what I'm saying
You're good.
catches up. Cool.
Good.
All right, so context claims. Just a couple of things to raise here. I mean, I think the most important information is there on that slide, but just to focus on a couple of things. With content claims, with most policies, they're sort of bundled together, but they're actually, they will be treated as two separate claims, essentially, but dealt with together. But the main thing after a disaster is, and I'll link it back to what Paul said earlier about, you know, people having to tell the story once, you know, to reduce the chances of them being re-traumatized by telling their story. One of these issues is where insurers in the past have requested that people itemize, put a list together of all of their items after a disaster is an incredibly difficult thing to do. It's a traumatizing thing to do is for somebody to put a list together of everything they've just lost. But also the impact of the trauma means that they'd probably find it very difficult to actually do that. I think if I was to sit down now and put a list of all my contents, I think I would struggle to do that, you know, right now. So you think of the impact of a disaster and then requiring them to put together a list. I think our main message is, if there is a total loss, or even if it's close to a total loss in terms of contents, then they shouldn't be required to put a list together of all the items that they've just lost. In the new code of practice, the new general insurance code of practice, they do make mention of this. So it is something that industry is aware of, and certainly something that we should be telling our clients that it's one of the things that one of the hurdles that they shouldn't have to jump after a disaster. So the only times where I think it might be reasonable for an insurer to require an itemized list is if or in the scenario where your client may be overinsured and have very little contents. You know, the contents, the value of the contents may not be, you might not be able to show that there's been a total loss. So I think in that scenario, it'd be reasonable for an insurer to require an itemized list. But otherwise, if you've got a client that has lost everything, if you can make the case to the insurer that pretty much it's total loss or very close to a total loss, they should be settling the claim as a total loss and not requiring your client to actually put together a list. I think that's the main thing to think about your contents. Contents again will be, it is technically separate in that it would have, generally would have its own sum insured amount. So you'll have your sum insured for the building, your building cover, and then you'll have your sum insured for the contents cover, which is obviously a lot less than what your building cover generally is. So.
And the other thing I'd add, Marta, is if you forget something, it's reasonable to go back. People think that the first list is the only, if it's reasonable for a list to be done, people think the first list is the only list they can possibly give to an insurer. We're all human, we forget stuff. I can't remember what I did on Monday. If you remember something, go back to the insurer, say, I forgot about this. Can we put it on my contract?
Yeah, definitely.
Someone's made a suggestion here to take lots of photos of household contents in each room, shed, etc. Photos can be a great memory aid, but I guess that's pre-disaster, really. So.
If you're in a position to do that, that would be helpful. Obviously, you need to store those photos online somewhere where it's at risk of being lost in a fire or lost in a disaster. But yes, if you're in a position to do that, that could be very helpful.
Okay, so we'll move forward on to talk about fences and animals.
Okay, so this is my gig again. So this is a big issue, and probably one of the reasons I got to do this is because I do work with farmers. So it's a big issue for farmers, particularly fences and animals. Generally speaking, for fences, there is no insurance, and for livestock, it can be quite problematic and very expensive. So again, there is often not any insurance that may cover these things. There's three things though that people can do in those cases. One is that there might be some charities that can assist. There's often grants available, and there's loans that are available through a number of organisations. So the one charity that has helped in the past to repair fences is LAQLD, though there's been some mixed reviews about their assistance to the timeliness of the assistance, because often farmers will require that to be done immediately. They can't wait. And of course, it's simply resourcing issues. Often when there has been disasters, there might be state government programs or council programs for grants to rebuild fences. The people that are best placed to assist clients in this, particularly in Queensland, is the rural financial counsellors. They are really across these sorts of grants, and if you have anyone coming to you that's looking for assistance with replacing fences, they're really good referral. In Queensland, there's the Queensland Rural Investment Development Corporation that really can, that manages government programs, loans and grants. They often have, if there's a disaster, they might have time limited grants or loans, and the loans will often be at reduced interest rates, or can often be for a period of time no interest at all or no repayments. And there's also the federal government program has a similar program, which is the Regional Investment Corporation, which can have loans and grants as well when disaster strikes. So one of the things that I just noticed on their website this morning, they're just about to launch a program for plantation loans, so that where plantations were lost in bushfires, it's to encourage people to reinvest in those. So with things that aren't covered in a disaster and where they relate to particularly farming, it's a good idea to really access the rural financial counselling services in your own state. That's all that I've got about fences and animals. Over to you.
Okay. We're now going to talk about debris.
So I'm up for debris. Okay, so I hope everybody can hear me now. So about debris, this has been a pain point of mine. Paul will know because I talk about this a lot. So the main points are there on the slide again. It'll either be covered or not in an insurance policy. And one of the things that you're looking at, I mean, they technically under the policies, they will be listed as an additional benefit, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's an additional amount on top of your sum insured. So in a lot of cases, the debris benefit, if it is included in your policy, they will fall under the sum insured, so be included within the sum insured. If you're lucky enough to have it as an additional cost, this could really help in your rebuild, because then it doesn't eat into your sum insured, and that would be your cost to rebuild. So sorry, the money for your rebuild. After a disaster, many state governments will offer all sorts of grants, and one of the programs that they will offer or may offer is a cleanup program, where the government will cover the cost of the cleanup. Well, technically, the government will have some sort of agreement with industry of that state about what the expectation is with the cleanup and what happens with the costs and that sort of thing, which is a matter between them, and be very hard pressed to get any specific details from them about that deal. But I think the important thing for our clients is whether or not they would be able to seek the amounts for the debris removal, or the cost for the debris removal, to be passed on to them from the insurer, and that, which could be a major benefit for the clients, because it could add or maybe patch up the gap between how much it's going to cost them to rebuild their property and how much they're actually insured for. So again, you're looking at whether the debris cost or the debris benefit is an additional benefit on top of the sum insured. What we did in the bushfires was we made arguments to the insurers, or we raised with the insurers, that any cost for the debris removal, even though our client hasn't paid for it out of their own pocket, but it was provided for by the government, that the insurer should be passing on that cost, that savings to our clients, or to the insured. Our philosophy around that is that insurers shouldn't gain a benefit from the government offering these services to help out the community, and also that our clients have been paying for these policies, and the premiums, part of the factors with the premiums is what benefits you actually get out of your policy. So in our mind, that is money better in our clients' pockets to help them with their recovery than remaining with the insurers. I think that sort of argument, though, only really helps where, if your client has a total loss and the debris removal benefit is an additional benefit on top of the sum insured, then asking the insurers to pass on the savings is where we think it would work. Or where there's been a partial loss, so there's still a bit of the sum insured left, but there's a partial loss that required debris removal, that you also ask for the savings to be passed on to your clients, or the clients can ask for themselves, pass on the savings to them that will help them with that additional costs or additional money to help them with their rebuild. We saw some significant outcomes when we raised them with insurers. Insurers were very open to it. We raised them. It could be a difference of a couple of thousands of dollars, so tens of thousands of dollars. It could actually make a massive difference. So something to be mindful of is what debris removal or cleanup program the government has on offer, and how you can actually maximise your client's insurance claim with their insurer. And that's it.
One of our audience, again from East Gippsland, saying that they found that insurance policies covered up to $10,000 for removal of debris. However, the company that was doing it was charging the Victorian government $90,000 per site. So there was a significant shortfall. And a couple of insurance companies tried to exclude paying out on the cleanup when this company did it because of that cost. And so it's resulted in many AFCA complaints. So
as it should.
Yeah.
So disappointing the Victorian government chose that company, I guess, to do those cleanups at that cost. All right, so you ready to pass it on, or on to the next one? So the next one is lodging a complaint against an insurance refusal.
And look, I think we're all going to jump in here and have a bit of a chat about this one. But my starting point about this one is, in theory, to lodge an IDR complaint, all you actually have to do is say, I disagree. But that's not going to get you very far when it comes to getting your refusal overturned. And I actually think this is actually where the Bush Telegraph actually comes in really handy, because what you find is people are leaving their properties at different times. Some people are taking video. Occasionally, I think I've actually seen drone footage occasionally of the water coming up to properties. That doesn't work so well in bushfires, I find. Please don't send up your drones in a bushfire. But what you're getting from the Bush Telegraph is a whole range of information where you can add to the client's experience, because the key to disputing IDR claim or insurance refusals of IDR, and Marta talked about this earlier, is people's experience. Because you don't usually have the money available to challenge claims, but what you do have is what people saw, what people heard, what people experienced. And over the years, that's led to literally hundreds, if not thousands of claims having a different decision, because people have got the evidence of what people saw, what people heard, and what people experienced. The other comment I'd make is the hardest bit for the clients we deal with is to get the emotion out of it. Emotional submissions, in my experience of doing this for 13 years, have never overturned an insurance refusal. What overturns it is, what did the insurer get wrong legally, and what evidence do we have that what the insurer said happened didn't actually happen.
So simply saying it's unfair because of their personal circumstances, I agree, Paul, isn't going to help. And I thought we'd go back to the question that was asked earlier about the insurer only paying for internals rather than the guttering and the roof. I suspect, even though we don't know, that the legal basis for that is that they might say, well, this was a flood event, say, for example, and the water went up to a certain level. Why are we paying for the roof and externals? Or so again, this is where having what the circumstances were is a really good of the event that happened is a really good way of countering some of the argument as to why they're not paying for other damage that has occurred. So I have heard of that before, where the insurer, I think through the flood stuff, where they said, well, we'll only pay up to a metre because that's where the flood were, but water might also have come through the roof as part of the storm event or flood event, and it's not reasonable in those cases for them to only be paying for where the flood damage went to in that one event.
Or the classic is the guttering wasn't done properly originally.
Yeah.
And so it's excluded, and we'll come to my pet hate of repair clauses shortly, but it's excluded on the basis of a lack of maintenance.
Yes.
at large complaints is the theory should be that you just say dispute. At least that should start the process, the complaints process. And you know, especially when you're looking at whether you're trying to get additional evidence, what I would say is that you do is you start the complaint, because the clock on the insurer resolving the complaint doesn't restart if you're submitting more information. The clock continues, and the clock can be quite useful. I mean, it is useful. Having the clock is useful, particularly for those who are making a claim after a disaster, because you want something done about it sooner rather than later. And so if you're thinking, oh, I'll just wait until I gather all the evidence and have it in a neatly, package, in neatly bow-tied package before I send it off, I don't think that's necessarily going to be helpful. I think you want to get the complaint in, set out the reasons why you think they're wrong in making that decision or declining the claim, and then if you then have evidence to submit later, you can always do that later, and that doesn't restart the clock. But you want the insurer to start reviewing, because they've got to review their decision process anyway. And so you want them to start that process.
Agreed. That's a really good point.
Okay, so we'll move on then to
step number 2.
Step number 2, right? Yes.
So what will often happen is, well, in some cases the IDR process will see the claim get paid, but in a number of cases it won't. And so clients will be going, well, what do I do now? Many people on the webinar will know about AFCA and know about the process of making a complaint to AFCA. Just to reinforce, they are free and they're independent, so they will look at a case completely separately of any of us and completely separate of the insurer. And that's a really important thing, I think, to reinforce with clients who assume that a complaint mechanism, they might have had a bad experience with a complaint mechanism before and assume that they'll just take the insurer's word for it. That simply just does not happen. Does it mean that every insurance claim that's disputed you win at AFCA? Absolutely not. But what it does mean is you get an expert re-looking at it with an independent eye, and I think that's a really powerful thing that AFCA does. And the other thing to highlight about what AFCA does is, if necessary, they actually go out to the property. We've had a number of cases over the years where somebody from AFCA will go out to the property so that they can get a picture of it themselves, of where the water might have came from or where the bushfire might have came from. And I think the benefit to the clients of that, of having somebody there who's making that independent decision, are just enormous.
Paul, I think you're so right about that. In a lot of these matters, moving away from having face-to-face interaction can be very detrimental to our clients. And even if it doesn't necessarily change the view of the decision maker, I think that clients feel heard if the insurer has, or both the insurer and AFCA have gone and seen them on the property. I think it's a really powerful tool, both from a resolving the complaint point of view, but also in resolving the issue for the client so that they can move forward if the decision is not in their favour.
I'd also like to just mention a tip for particular to our lawyer friends who are all tuning in, is that, you know, we always get sort of complicate things. I think we're at risk of complicating lodging submissions to AFCA. You know, you're always trying to get your evidence or, you know, lined up and all of that kind of stuff. I mean, that could be helpful, but you just remember that AFCA is not a court. So all those strict rules about evidence, and, you know, like you can evidence your client's, you know, experience is evidence. You can put that together and submit that to AFCA. So I think it's important for those of you who are assisting consumers to lodge a complaint with AFCA is to be mindful of that. It doesn't have to be all pretty before you lodge it. AFCA are quite experienced. I mean, the point of AFCA is for people to represent themselves as well, self-represented litigants. So they're not expecting for everything to really be all, picture perfect and submit before it's submitted to them. They're quite experienced in sort of going through whatever's been lodged with them to work out what they need to know. And also just be mindful that while AFCA, they do refer to legal principles, precedents, and all that kind of stuff, but they have a jurisdiction that's quite broad, which is that fair and reasonable jurisdiction, which can be very helpful in lodging your submissions and very helpful in the determining the determination of your client's complaint, because they do go beyond just what you submit. They will look at what is the most fair and reasonable way of resolving a dispute will be. I mean, that's not to say that all of the disputes are going to result in a positive outcome for your clients, but it is useful, I find, to be mindful that their jurisdiction is not limited in the way that courts are, that specifically evidence, strict evidence rules, that sort of stuff. They're quite open for you to submit other things that you think would be helpful.
And Marta, AFCA's on record as saying black letter law will not always lead to a specific result in AFCA. And I think that's really powerful.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we're now coming up with a slide that says claims agents.
Yes, claims agent, yes.
Oh, that's me, I think.
Yep.
Claims agent. Okay, so if you've heard of ambulance chasers, claim agents are often referred to as storm chasers within the industry. So can we go to that page?
Yeah, well, I've gone on there on mine. I'm just checking that it hasn't come up on yours yet.
About it.
Just refresh it. So
There we go.
Thank you. Okay, so as I mentioned, we often refer to them as storm chasers. Industry is quite aware of them. We've dealt with them. I've dealt with some clients who had come to us after they've racked up quite a bill with the claims agents. My experience has been that claims agents tend to be ex-insurance employees who no doubt have some quite a bit of knowledge about insurance, but what I've often found, my experience has been that their involvement hasn't necessarily achieved a better outcome, and the ones that I'm thinking of in particular actually resulted in unreasonable delays in having the claim being resolved. So a matter that should have been, escalated to IDR earlier on or should have gone to AFCA simply didn't happen because of the claims agent's own, thought process that that's not the way they want to do it. But obviously for our clients, it's detrimental for our clients. It means a much longer, protracted claims handling process for them. And it also raises questions around whether our client is liable for the delay in resolving their complaint rather than the insurer having anything to do with those delays. So one of the things that we just always want to, after a disaster, what we find is we'll have claims agents sort of go into community and simply walk up and down streets and talk to people and offer their services, and they'll offer it for a fee. I'm not entirely sure how clear they make that to consumers, but what I do know is that these fees are exorbitant. They go into thousands of dollars. One person I saw, and this was before it hit AFCA, was about $16,000 for the work they did before it hit AFCA, and the work they actually did didn't actually even help. And the problem for our clients is, one, they're not in a position to pay this, and if if they had $16,000, it would be much better spent on their repairs rather than having to pay for these claims agents. But also, it's a cost that they're not going to be able to get, even if they're successful in AFCA, they're not going to be able to get that cost back. So I struggle to see what the real benefits are of using a claims agent. But I guess the important thing is to make sure that they're aware that insurance, the whole dispute process is free to our clients, it's free to consumers. And they might need some guidance in helping them with that process, but they shouldn't have to pay for a fee to get through it, especially where it's not really necessarily going to help them with their claim. So just something to be mindful that there are these services out there, not necessarily something that our clients will sort of gain anything from, unfortunately, as far as my experience has been. But just be mindful of that they're out there.
And be aware too that some of them have decided not to get licensed for the coming licensing regime on 1 January 2022. And I've already started to see instances where they're telling the clients, we can no longer act for you post this date. And here's a helpful referral to somebody who can. And here's our bill. Or so if you please refer them for legal advice, because I saw one this morning. So they're already starting to happen, and I suspect you'll see more and more of them out there the closer we get to 1 January 2022.
And can I just say something else really in support of Marta's point about the process being free? I don't think it's not even about it being free, but it's actually the whole process is designed so that consumers can navigate it themselves. If a person can't navigate it themselves or navigate it without assistance, then it's a systems issue, and that we really ought to be addressing that. The appropriate response is not to have a claims agent, that it's required that you have a claims agent that will cost you thousands of dollars. So yeah, I think and that's why we often will provide the advice, because consumers should be able to go through this process without requiring representation.
And you'll see in the handout that there's references to ourselves, LAQLD New South Wales, and the Insurance Law Service, who provide that service to clients who might need a bit of help along the way for free as well. So I'd call out the Financial Rights Legal Centre, who runs the Insurance Law Service, because that phone number is a nationwide phone number.
That's a good reminder that those handouts are on everyone's control panel, so I think they can download those during the webinar. And so we're moving on, are we, to the next one, maintenance of repair clauses.
Yes, I've already had a little bit of a whinge about this. These clauses are valid exclusions from an insurance policy. If insurance is set up so that you're covered unless you're excluded from cover, and if you don't keep a property in such a way that I would describe it as unnecessary damage that could have been prevented occurred because of your lack of maintenance or not repairing the property properly, then I have no issue with an insurer refusing the claim, none whatsoever. Where I have an issue is if they just say we're refusing it on a lack of maintenance, because that helps nobody. What if I see those? The questions I'm always asking insurers: okay, what maintenance or repair did you say wasn't done, or what repair do you say wasn't done or not done properly? And then tell me what the difference would have been had that maintenance or repair been done. Because if they can do that, to me, then that's a valid refusal. If they can't do that, then I'm usually taking it further, because it's not enough to say to somebody, I'm refusing your claim on a lack of maintenance, if the answer is you wanted the 72-year-old pensioner up on the roof checking the roof every 3 months for damage. Because to me that's a, don't laugh, it's been done.
Well, I wouldn't want a 30-year-old or a 40-year-old either on there.
That's right. So to me, to rely on these clauses successfully, you need to have a reasonable basis and a reasonable explanation of what difference would have been made had the insured done what you're suggesting they should have done. And if there is no difference, i.e. in the cyclone, the 200k an hour winds still would have ripped the roof off, then I don't think you can deny a claim on a lack of maintenance or a lack of repair in those circumstances.
All right. Marta, you weren't adding anything to that?
Oh no, covered, Paul and Loretta covered it. That's the main issue. I think that's the sentence, see, the one where it says what difference it would have made, I think that's the starting point really for us if we're assisting people in raising this dispute. Like Paul says, if a tornado came through, what difference would my missing tile on my roof have made? To, the tornado ripping up my whole house. So yeah, they should be able to explain what the maintenance expectation is that would have prevented the damage.
Okay, well, we're moving now on to financial hardship.
So I'm going to be talking about this, or starting the conversation off about this. When people obviously are lose property as a result of a natural disaster, it's likely that they're also going to may be in financial hardship as a result of that. For example, they may not be able to pay their mortgages because with their lender, because they don't have work, or for a whole variety of reasons. And it's really important, particularly if there's two things. There might be issues with the whole insurance process, which might mean that they are in financial hardship. And Paul has just pointed out that there's new changes to the Code of Practice from the 5th of October, and they will especially address financial hardship in relation to the payment of premiums, which is a really good step forward, so that people may be able to access some assistance from their insurer if they are having problems paying for their premiums, particularly following a natural disaster or in other circumstances as well. If you have a mortgage, it's really important to ask for financial hardship from your lender. And if you can't come to an arrangement with the lender, complain to AFCA. Financial counsellors are really helpful in this area. They often know about the local council programs for local council rate relief, the state government assistance programs, and those other help that I've outlined there. They're also very helpful in negotiating with your lender. So, and in particular in these sorts of situations where a person has had damage to their home, it might take them quite an extended period of time to get back on track because of all the other expenses associated with being a victim of a natural disaster. And so to be realistic with the way in which you ask for that assistance with the lender is really important, so that you can get the maximum amount of time. It is also important to understand that when you have a mortgage, there's a requirement that you keep the property insured, and so that you can't let your insurance lapse because when you're disputing with your lender, because that may also affect or be a breach of your mortgage with the lender. But again, any of those disputes, and when you're unhappy with any of the responses from the lender, that's when you can go to their own internal dispute resolution process and then on to the Australian Financial Complaints Authority if you can't resolve it with the lender. I didn't want to add anything more to that. So Paul and Marta, over to you if you have anything more.
I think the key thing is just to remember to keep, if it gets to 3 or 5 years after a natural disaster and the banks have forgotten, which they occasionally do, that the natural disaster happened in that area, it's okay to keep going back to the banks asking for further hardship and just reminding them that the recovery takes years.
So just one last thing about hardship is, sorry, Lauren, if you've already covered, is payment of excess with your claims. You shouldn't have to pay that up front for a claim to be processed. So if your client's not in a position to pay their excess, that could be resolved by the insurer and take that out from the cash settlement. So don't be swayed by the insurer saying they won't process a claim until an excess is paid. They should have a policy in place about what to do in those circumstances where excess can't be paid, particularly after a disaster.
Really good point.
Okay, so we'll move on to the General Insurance Code of Practice 2020.
Look, and this is really just an information slide in a lot of ways. This is us saying that the Insurance Council and the insurers did do a lot of work with consumer advocates like ourselves in the review of the most recent review of the insurance code. And there's a lot of really good stuff in there around helping customers experiencing vulnerability and financial hardship and things like that. And so I would recommend, if you haven't had a look at those sections, there is some useful stuff in there about how insurers will look at helping people. And I think it applies to following natural disasters as well. There's also, outside of natural disaster stuff, if you're helping clients, there's a lot of really good stuff in there that you might not have expected to be in there if you're not in this day to day. And it's just worth having a quick flick through because this is the insurers committing to helping clients, often over and above the existing legal obligations. And so I would commend that, and particularly the vulnerability and financial hardship provisions, because they do help our clients following natural disasters and even before natural disasters.
Okay, no one has anything to add to that. There hasn't been any questions for a while. So referral pathways, that's coming up now. Looks like one of the recovery centres there.
Correct. I think it's pretty self-explanatory, that slide. Those referral pathways, at least for Queensland and for New South Wales, those are our dedicated disaster lines. Either before a disaster strikes, I mean, our line is open now. People can call, but of course, we're still getting calls from people who are still recovering from the bushfires, 2019, 2020 bushfires, and in New South Wales, the floods in March earlier this year. So that line, for us at least, is open for disaster impacted clients. We do deal with insurance matters along with other issues, other common issues that come up after a disaster. And I think my colleagues there in Queensland also much the same for them. The other service that we've got listed there is the Financial Rights Legal Services Insurance Law Service. That's a dedicated line that they have for insurance obviously being a national law. So they are one of the only ones that I'm aware of that provides the service nationally. The legal aid commissions are in operation in other states, and they have other arrangements, but these are our contact details.
There isn't a question, but someone has made the good note that there's also community legal centres available to people who people can speak to regarding disaster issues, legal issues, and each of the community legal centres have their peak bodies in each state and territory, and their websites will give details of the local community legal centres. But yeah, there's no.
That's an excellent point, and remiss of us for not mentioning them. So our apologies for that.
Because I think the community legal centres, I know in New South Wales, at least in the areas, did additional funding as well, didn't they, Marta? So you've been working with them closely.
Yes, and
Can
also
I
was out there as well. Provincial councils get some funding around the bushfires to help people recovering from the bushfire. So lots of experience out there, and I'm certain there's a few of you tuning in. So a big thanks to everybody that's involved in the disaster space. But there are plenty of services out there available for those who need it.
And Loretta, were you going to say something as well?
I was only going to make the point, though, that it's really important that for Queensland, we can't provide advice for people who live outside of the state. So that's why, in particular, it's important to have a look at what's available in your state if you're not in Queensland and New South Wales, and that the only national service is that one from the financial right, that's run through the Financial Rights Legal Centre.
And the other point that's worth making too is people will often assume that because it's legal aid, they can't get help with natural disaster stuff. And I don't know about Legal Aid New South Wales, but the only advice I remember refusing to give was somebody who wanted advice about their 99 investment properties following the floods in Brisbane. And that to me was a no. But people who are dealing with losing their house will, as a general rule, get free advice about their insurance issue with no problem at all.
Really good point, Paul. Thanks for bringing that point up. In experience that Legal Aid New South Wales has been, and I think it's quite common in the disaster space, is lots of areas that are impacted. The people that live in those communities often run businesses. Small businesses, that sort of thing, and generally legal aid wouldn't necessarily be available to business owners, but in a disaster it's quite a different situation, and we speak to business owners after a disaster. We linked up with other services that provide maybe ongoing assistance. We might not be able to provide the ongoing assistance, but we will certainly be happy to speak with them and see how we can assist.
Is that worth mentioning then, Marta, the pro bono support you've also had from private sectors?
Yes, thanks for that, Carrie. I think after a disaster, there's so much goodwill out there, and that includes the whole legal assistance sector, involving also the private sector as well. And there's lots of pro bono offerings from the private sector when it comes to disasters. And in a disaster, at least for Legal Aid in New South Wales, we do work together with everyone in the legal assistance sector, and that includes the CLC, so legal centres, the private sector, the pro bono services available as well. We try to link everybody up, because I guess what we try to do, and our philosophy for those who work in this space, in the disaster space, is if we can make things just that one step easier for those impacted by the disaster, then we will try to do that. So that could be, we will provide the advice and then maybe link them up, connect them with the local service if that's what they need, or connect them with a pro bono service if that's what they need. So There's lots of people working in this space, so I think that's the best way that we can really try to get to as many people as we can is by working together and collaborating together, which is partly why this presentation or this webinar has come about.
And also, there may be a disaster at a certain period of time, but if people are still dealing with issues that resulted from that disaster, there's no time limit as to when they can contact you, is there?
Absolutely.
No.
None what?
No.
Just not on the weekends, but they can contact us anytime afterwards. We know from the research and the studies that the recovery journey is a long one, can be a very long one for some people. So yeah, they can call us at any time, really, get in contact with us.
Yeah, and community workers who may be working with people who are dealing with a whole range of issues can put people in touch with you when needed. So there's no questions coming through. People are saying fantastic webinar. Thanks very much. Thank you. Very informative. So I think your audience is very appreciative of what you've delivered to them today. And obviously there's those handouts. And the webinar's been recorded, so that will go up on the YouTube channel as I mentioned. And I think when we close the webinar, there will be a survey. So we really appreciate your feedback, including telling us what other things you might like us to address in future webinars, because we love them so much. Apologies that there were some tech issues at the beginning, and you know, that's just how it is, this world we live in now, doing everything online, and everyone's been really patient, so we appreciate that. And I imagine there'll also be a follow-up email. There usually is after our webinars with some contact details, but you have our contact details that was in the presentation, so feel free to get in touch and refer your clients as well. So thank you, Paul, Loretta and Marta, for your time today. No more questions, so I think we're free to go. Just on time. Well done.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks,
Okay.
everyone.
Thank you.
See you.
Bye.
Bye.